Politicians keep saying the same thing. Foreign countries are paying these tariffs. China is paying, Mexico is paying, but that's not what the data shows. A study that analyzed 25 million shipment records, nearly $4 trillion in imports, found that foreign exporters absorbed just 4% of the cost. That means that US buyers paid the other 96%. In other words, almost all of the tariff expenses show up in American prices. And that's not a political opinion, that's just the data. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how tariffs affect prices and why American consumers are the ones actually paying. Let's start with what a tariff actually is. A tariff is just a tax on imported goods, and it's paid by the American company bringing the product into the country. So if a US retailer imports $100,000 worth of furniture from China, and there's a 25% tariff, they owe $25,000 to the US government the moment those goods arrive. It's the importer that pays the tariff, not China, not Mexico, but the American company that's importing the goods. But here's where it gets interesting. Just because the importer technically pays the tariff doesn't mean they're the only one who eats the cost. They basically have three options. They can raise prices and pass it on to you. They can absorb it and take lower profit margins, or the foreign supplier can cut their price to offset the tariff. So the real question isn't who pays it on paper, it's who actually ends up paying it in real life. Researchers at the Kiel Institute analyzed over 25 million shipment records, nearly $4 trillion worth of US imports. And here's what they found. Tariffs brought in about $200 billion in US customs revenue in 2025, but foreign exporters absorbed about 4% of that by lowering prices. The other 96%, that got passed straight to US buyers. So for every $100 in new tariff costs, American businesses and consumers paid about $96. The New York Federal Reserve ran a similar analysis using import data through November 2025. They found almost the same thing. Nearly 90% of the tariff burden landed on US firms and households. And since the average tariff in December was around 13%, they calculated that import prices for affected goods rose about 11% more than goods without tariffs. In other words, if tariffs go up 13%, prices go up about 11%. Almost all of it gets passed through. Now let's look at a real world example. In August 2025, the US suddenly raised tariffs on Brazil to 50% and on India from 25% to 50%. And researchers compared Indian exports to the US with Indian exports to Europe and Canada. And here's what happened. Shipments to the US dropped by as much as 24%. Indian companies sent way less product to America, but their prices didn't change. They didn't discount anything, they just sold less. So the tariffs didn't force exporters to lower prices, it just reduced supply. And Americans who still bought those goods paid more. That's the key insight. Foreign exporters, they don't eat the tariff, they just ship less. And US consumers end up paying higher prices. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, if tariffs hurt American consumers, why do governments keep using them? And the answer is, tariffs aren't designed purely for economic efficiency. They're used as leverage against other countries. Governments use tariffs to pressure foreign countries, protect strategic industries, and reduce dependence on overseas supply chains, especially for things like steel, energy, pharmaceuticals, or semiconductors. In other words, policymakers are often willing to accept higher prices at home if they believe it gives them more control abroad. Because from their perspective, tariffs aren't just an economic tool, they're a political weapon. They can force negotiations, they can punish rivals, they can encourage domestic production, and they could signal strength to voters. So while economists look at tariffs and they see higher costs, lower efficiency, and slower growth, politicians see bargaining power. They see a way to reshape supply chains. They see a way to protect jobs in key industries. They see a way to apply pressure without firing a shot. That doesn't change who pays, consumers still do, but it explains why tariffs exist in the first place. They're not about making goods cheaper, they're about shifting global power, even if that comes with an economic price tag at home. So how much have prices actually gone up? Harvard economists look at real-time barcode data, actual prices at the register and through early October 2025. They found that tariffs raised retail prices by an average of 4.9 percentage points compared to the pre-tariff trend. Imported goods specifically went up about 6%, but even domestic goods, products made in America, rose by 4.3%. And that surprises most people because tariffs don't just affect imports, they affect everything. Imagine there's a 50% tariff on imported steel. Foreign steel suddenly becomes much more expensive. So US manufacturers switch to domestic steel. But now domestic producers know they don't have to compete with cheap imports anymore. So they raise their prices too, keeping them just below the imported price. Overnight, all steel becomes more expensive. And that's exactly what happened during Trump's first term. Both imported and domestic steel and aluminum prices jumped after tariffs were imposed. So tariffs end up acting like a consumption tax while also giving domestic producers pricing power they didn't have before. Some products got hit harder than others. Apparel prices rose about 9 percentage points, coffee and tea went up 7.5 points, furniture jumped 6.5 points. But here's what's interesting. Those increases were still smaller than the actual tariff rates. If there's a 25% tariff, why didn't prices rise 25%? And there are basically three reasons. First is uncertainty. Tariff rates kept changing, so companies took a wait-and-see approach instead of immediately passing everything on. And second, some companies absorb part of the cost by lowering margins because they don't want to scare off customers. And third, a lot of businesses burned through inventory they'd stockpiled before the tariffs hit. And that allowed them to sell at old prices for a while, but that only works temporarily, and once inventory runs out, prices rise. And if you're investing, this matters too, because tariffs don't just hit consumers, they hit corporate profits. Companies that rely on global supply chains suddenly face higher input costs. If you're importing parts, raw materials, or finished goods, your costs just went up overnight. So you start to see some firms trying to raise prices, others try to absorb the cost, but either way, earnings get pressured. And markets care about earnings. A company trading at 20 times earnings suddenly sees profits fall 10%. That stock doesn't just dip a little, it can reprice fast. At the same time, some domestic industries temporarily benefit. If foreign competitors suddenly face a 25% or 50% tariff, US-based producers get pricing power. So you often see money rotate. Capital flows out of multinational consumer brands that depend on cheap global supply chains and into sectors like industrials, materials, or defense. But the catch is, those benefits are usually temporary because higher input costs eventually ripple through the entire economy. And slower trade means slower growth means weaker demand, and weaker demand eventually hurts everyone, even the industries that benefited at first. That's why trade wars create volatility. Investors aren't just reacting to the tariff itself, they're constantly repricing. Who has pricing power? Who has global exposure? Who can shift supply chains? How long will this last? And when policy keeps changing, markets hate that uncertainty. So tariffs don't just change prices at the store, they reshape capital flows, sector performance, earning expectations, and long-term growth projections. And that's why trade policy shows up in your portfolio, even if you never think about it at the checkout counter. Now, to be fair, tariffs aren't always pointless. There are a lot of situations where they actually worked and were needed. Take China, for example. For years, US companies were dealing with forced technology transfers, state-subsidized competitors, and closed Chinese markets while American markets stayed wide open. And normal diplomacy, it didn't change any of that. Nothing moved until tariffs were put on the table. Only then did China agree to the Phase 1 deal, the first time they formally committed to reducing forced tech transfers, strengthening intellectual property protections, and opening parts of their financial sector up. Did China fully comply with everything? No. But without tariffs, there was zero movement. And in this case, tariffs were what got them to the table. And the same thing with Europe. European governments had been subsidizing Airbus for years, letting it undercut Boeing. The US won that case at the World Trade Organization, but rulings don't enforce themselves. Tariffs did. Only after tariffs hit did Europe agree to suspend subsidies and negotiate. That's a direct example of tariffs protecting a strategic industry. And then there's North America. NAFTA encouraged offshoring, but tariff threats forced a rewrite into the USMCA with higher North American content requirements for cars and wage rules for Mexican auto workers, and more access for US farmers. Mexico literally changed its labor laws, and that doesn't happen from polite meetings. It happens when tariffs are on the table. So yes, sometimes tariffs are necessary, but notice what they're doing. They're not making things cheaper. They're being used as pressure to change behavior, rewrite rules, and force negotiations. They work as a geopolitical tool, not as a way to lower prices for consumers. So here's the bottom line. I'm not saying tariffs are always bad. They can work and they can be useful. And in some cases, they've clearly been used to apply pressure and force negotiations that would not have happened otherwise. But you have to understand what they're actually designed to do. Tariffs are not a discount program. They're not a magic way to make foreign countries pay your bills. They're a geopolitical tool. And like any tool, they come with trade-offs. If policymakers believe the strategic benefit is worth the economic cost, that's a conversation we can honestly have. That's politics. But economically, the data is clear. The cost does not stay overseas. It shows up at the register, it shows up in higher input costs, it shows up in corporate earnings, it shows up in inflation. So whether you support tariffs or you oppose them, at least understand the system. Because once you understand who actually pays, you can evaluate the policy honestly and even make better financial decisions.